In 1434, a banker returned from exile to Florence and, within months, controlled the entire city. He commanded no army. He held no official title. He never wore a crown or sat on a throne. His name was Cosimo de Medici, and his weapon wasn't violence. It was something far more insidious. Debt. Strategic, calculated, weaponized debt that transformed a republic into an oligarchy without a single battle when his enemies exiled him. Thinking they'd eliminated the threat, they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that half of Florence's nobility owed him money. And when you owe a man your fortune, you don't just fear him, you need him. Within a year of his exile, those same nobles begged for his return, not because they loved him, because they were drowning in debts that only Cosimo could restructure. He came back not as a conqueror, but as a savior, and that made him untouchable. For the next 30 years, Cosimo de Medici ruled Florence without ever ruling it. He never held office longer than 2 months at a time. He lived modestly. He called himself a simple citizen. But every major decision in the city required his approval, because every powerful family owed him their survival. This is the story of the man who proved that the greatest conquest isn't military, it's financial. And the strongest chains aren't made of iron, they're made of obligation. Before Cosimo de Medici, Florence was a republic. Powerful families competed for influence through elected councils. No single dynasty dominated. The Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Puzzi, all vied for control through traditional means. Military alliances, political marriages, public office. Cosimo changed the rules entirely. He understood that in a merchant republic, the real power wasn't in the signoria or the councils. It was in the ledgers. Whoever controlled credit, controlled everything else. If you're seeing how one man rewrote the nature of political power itself, hit that like button. And if you want to follow the complete story of how money conquered republics, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We're uncovering the origins of systems that still rule today. Born in 1389 into the Medici banking family, Cosimo inherited a profitable but politically vulnerable business. His father, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, had built the bank into respectability through papal banking contracts. But respectability wasn't safety. Florence was dangerous for the wealthy. The city had a history of sudden political turns. Families that rose too high were exiled or destroyed by jealous rivals. Wealth made you a target, which meant that simply being rich wasn't enough. You had to make yourself indispensable. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Cosimo's strategy of control through obligation still operates in your political system today, just under different names. Let's explore how the first modern political boss built an empire by making everyone owe him everything. Cosimo de' Medici understood something his competitors didn't. Military power was expensive, temporary, and obvious. Financial power was cheap, permanent, and invisible. When Cosimo took over the Medici Bank in 1420 at age 31, Florence was a financial capital of Europe. The city's bankers financed popes, kings, and trade across the continent. But most banks operated as simple lenders. You borrowed money, paid interest, settled the debt, and the relationship ended. Cosimo saw the flaw in this model. Once the debt was repaid, your leverage disappeared. So he developed a different approach. Strategic lending designed not to be repaid, but to create permanent dependence. He identified the most politically powerful families in Florence, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Pitti, and offered them loans on favorable terms for necessary expenses. A daughter's dowry, a son's business venture, a palazzo renovation. Nothing scandalous. Just the ordinary cost of maintaining aristocratic dignity. But Cosimo structured these loans cleverly. Low interest rates, flexible repayment schedules, extensions granted freely. On the surface, he appeared generous. In reality, he was building a network of permanent debtors. Because here's what Cosimo understood. When you owe someone money, you don't want to see them fail. Their failure means your debt becomes due immediately, possibly to hostile collectors. Their success means your obligation can continue indefinitely at manageable terms. By making repayment easy but unnecessary, Cosimo created a class of nobles whose financial security depended on his continued prosperity and goodwill. They didn't fear him in the traditional sense. They needed him, which was far more powerful. He combined this financial strategy with political intelligence. The Medici Bank had branches across Europe: Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London. These weren't just commercial offices. They were information hubs. Cosimo knew about trade disruptions before merchants. He heard about papal politics before most cardinals. He learned about military movements before generals reported them. This information allowed him to time his political moves with precision. When the Albizzi family, Florence's dominant political clan, tried to consolidate power in 1433, Cosimo knew about it before they'd finalized their plans. The Albizzi recognized Cosimo as a threat. His wealth was growing. His network was expanding. And worst of all, he was popular with the working classes. His bank employed hundreds. His building projects gave work to thousands. And his taxes were lighter than the old aristocracies. They decided to eliminate him before he became unstoppable. In September 1433, they engineered Cosimo's arrest on charges of conspiracy against the Republic. It was a setup. The evidence was thin. But in Florence's political system, you didn't need strong evidence. You needed control of the councils. And the Albizzi had that. Cosimo was imprisoned in the Palazzo Vecchio, awaiting execution or permanent exile. The traditional fates for political enemies. This should have been the end of the Medici story. Instead, it became the beginning of Cosimo's complete triumph. Cosimo sat in his cell, knowing something his captors didn't. You can't imprison a bank. The Medici financial network continued operating. His agents moved money. His allies maneuvered politically. And most importantly, the debts owed to him remained active and pressing. The Albizzi had arrested Cosimo's body, but they couldn't arrest his ledgers. During his imprisonment, Cosimo demonstrated why financial power transcends physical power. He bribed his guards, not to escape, but to carry messages. He negotiated with political factions through intermediaries, and he made a calculated offer to key decision-makers. Commute my death sentence to exile, and your debts remain manageable. Execute me, and my bank calls all outstanding loans immediately. The threat was implicit, but clear. Many of the men judging him owed the Medici bank money. If Cosimo disappeared, their debts became immediately due to potentially hostile collectors. If he lived in exile, business could continue as usual. The sentence came, 10 years exile, not death. Cosimo would leave Florence, but he would live. The Albizzi celebrated. They'd remove their primary rival without creating a martyr. Florence could return to traditional aristocratic rule. But Cosimo understood what they didn't. Exile from Florence didn't mean exile from power. It just meant conducting business from a different city. He relocated to Venice, one of Florence's commercial rivals. And from Venice, he did something brilliant. He started calling in debts. Not all of them. Not immediately. Just strategically. He tightened credit for Albizzi allies. He demanded faster repayment from fence-sitters. He made life financially uncomfortable for those who'd supported his exile. Meanwhile, he extended credit generously to families who'd oppose his arrest. Low interest, flexible terms, clear message. Loyalty to Cosimo was rewarded. Opposition was expensive. Within months, Florence's political calculus began shifting. Families realized that Cosimo in Venice controlled their finances more effectively than the Albizzi in Florence controlled their politics. The economic pressure mounted. Trade suffered because Medici branches in other cities began declining Florentine letters of credit. Loans became hard to obtain. Interest rates rose. The Albizzi had political power, but Cosimo had financial power. And financial power, it turned out, could strangle a merchant republic without raising a sword. By September 1434, exactly 1 year after his exile, Florence's councils voted to recall Cosimo, not because they loved him, because the alternative was economic isolation. The Albizzi tried to resist, but their own allies abandoned them. Why? Because those allies owed Cosimo money. And now he was coming back with the power to restructure or demand repayment. Cosimo returned to Florence in October 1434. No army accompanied him. No violence marked his arrival. He simply walked back into the city as a private citizen. But everyone understood what had happened. The Republic had just demonstrated that it couldn't function without Medici credit. And that meant the Republic functionally belonged to Cosimo. Within weeks, his political enemies, the Albizzi and their closest allies, were exiled, not by Cosimo directly, by the same councils that had exiled him a year earlier. The message was clear. The city had changed allegiance, and it had changed not through conquest, but through the simple recognition that financial power was the only power that mattered. After his return, Cosimo did something unprecedented. He refused obvious power. He never made himself duke. He never claimed a throne. He held elected office only when required by law, and never for more than 2 months at a time. He lived in a palazzo that, while elegant, was modest by aristocratic standards. To any observer, Florence remained a republic. Elections continued. Councils met. Laws were debated and passed. Cosimo appeared as just another wealthy citizen. But beneath this Republican facade operated a different system entirely. Cosimo had learned from his exile that official power made you a target. His mistake in 1433 had been becoming too visible. His genius after 1434 was becoming invisible while remaining indispensable. He achieved this through a mechanism called a copiatory, election scrutineers who control which citizens could hold office. Officially, these positions rotated. In practice, Cosimo ensured they were always held by men who owed him favors, money, or both. These scrutineers decided which names went into the bags for which office holders were randomly drawn. Democracy continued in form, but Cosimo controlled who could be selected for power. The system was elegant. When someone hostile to Medici interests was selected for office, that person quickly discovered their term would be short, their power limited, and their political future dependent on cooperation. When someone aligned with Medici interests held office, suddenly legislation moved smoothly. Contracts were awarded generously and political futures brightened. The incentive structure was clear. Work with Cosimo and prosper. Work against him, and find herself politically isolated and financially stressed. But Cosimo didn't maintain power through coercion alone. He built legitimacy through patronage that benefited the entire city. He commissioned public works that employed thousands. He funded the rebuilding of churches and monasteries. He established Europe's first public library. He patronized artists like Donatello, Brunelleschi, and Fra Angelico, making Florence the cultural center of the Renaissance. Every project served a dual purpose. It genuinely improved the city and created classes of people, workers, artists, clergy, whose livelihoods depended on Medici generosity. His most brilliant political innovation was the catasto, Florence's tax system based on declared wealth. The catasto appeared fair. Everyone paid taxes proportional to their assets. But Cosimo understood that he who controls assessment controls burden. Through his influence in the scrutiny committees, he ensured that political enemies faced rigorous assessments, while allies received generous valuations. A family could be bankrupted not through direct attack, but simply through tax pressure. It was invisible warfare, and it was devastatingly effective. By the 1440s, Florence had transformed. It was still technically a republic. Elections still happened. Councils still debated. But real decisions were made in Cosimo's palazzo. Ambassadors from other states understood this. They bypassed official channels and went directly to Cosimo. Foreign rulers negotiated with him personally, knowing that whatever Florence's government agreed to meant nothing without Medici approval. The Pope recognized him as Florence's true ruler. The Holy Roman Emperor corresponded with him directly. Even Florence's enemies acknowledged that to deal with the city meant dealing with Cosimo, and yet he maintained the fiction of being a simple banker, a private citizen, a servant of the Republic. This wasn't modesty. It was strategic genius. As long as he held no official title, he couldn't be legally removed. As long as he claimed no throne, no one could accuse him of tyranny. He had found the perfect form of power. Total control with complete deniability. Cosimo understood something profound about human nature. People resent those who rule them, but feel obligated to those who help them. So he positioned himself not as Florence's master, but as its benefactor. Every act of power was framed as an act of service. When he influenced an election, it was to ensure qualified leadership. When he funded public works, it was civic duty. When he forgave a debt, it was Christian charity. The language mattered, because language shaped perception, and perception shaped legitimacy. He developed a system that would later be called clientelismo, patronage networks where loyalty flowed upward and benefits flowed downward. At the top sat Cosimo, distributing loans, contracts, offices, and favor. Below him were layers of clients, lesser nobles who owed him directly, merchants who depended on Medici bank credit, artisans who worked on Medici projects, workers who labored in Medici-funded construction. Each layer had incentive to maintain the system, because in patronage networks, your position depended not on merit or law, but on your connection to the patron. Break with Cosimo, and you lost not just the support, but the support of everyone above and below you in the network. You became isolated, vulnerable. His enemies discovered this the hard way. The Pitti family tried to challenge Medici dominance in the 1450s by building a palazzo larger than Cosimo's, a symbolic assertion of rival power. Cosimo didn't attack them directly. He simply withdrew credit. The Medici bank stopped extending loans to Pitti business ventures. Merchants who depended on Medici credit stopped dealing with the Pitti. Contractors who worked on Medici projects declined Pitti commissions. Within years, the Pitti finances collapsed. Their grand palazzo remained unfinished for decades. They never threatened Medici power again. The message was clear. You could have wealth or power in Florence, but only if Cosimo allowed it. But Cosimo's most sophisticated tool was something intangible: gratitude as political currency. Every favor he granted created a debt of obligation, and Florentine culture, steeped in honor and reciprocity, treated these obligations as seriously as financial debts. If Cosimo helped your son secure a position, you owed him. If he provided a dowry loan for your daughter, you owed him. If he intervened to reduce your tax assessment, you owed him. These weren't legal obligations. They were social ones, which made them more powerful because they couldn't be formally repaid and discharged. They lingered indefinitely, creating permanent relationships of dependence. By his later years, virtually every significant family in Florence had accumulated obligations to Cosimo. Some owed him money. Others owed him favors. Many owed him both. And because obligations could be inherited, even Cosimo's passing wouldn't free them. His son Piero, and later his grandson Lorenzo, would inherit not just wealth, but an entire network of people who owed the Medici family their political and financial survival. This was Cosimo's true genius. He didn't just accumulate power for himself. He created a system where power accumulated automatically, generation after generation, through the simple mechanism of obligation. He transformed Florence from a republic where power was contested through elections into an oligarchy where power was inherited through debt. And he did it without ever admitting that's what he was doing. Cosimo de Medici passed away on August 1st, 1464, at age 75, in his villa at Careggi outside Florence. The Signoria, Florence's governing council, granted him a title never before given to a private citizen. Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. It was official recognition of what everyone already knew. Cosimo had been Florence's true ruler for 30 years, despite never holding power officially. His funeral was modest by his instruction. No grand ceremonies, no military displays, just a simple burial in the family church of San Lorenzo, which he had rebuilt at his own expense. But the modesty was itself a statement. It said, I didn't need crowns or titles. My power was real enough without them. Cosimo's legacy wasn't the wealth he accumulated, though that was substantial. It wasn't the art he commissioned, though that defined an era. His legacy was the system he created, a model for how financial power could be converted into political control without triggering the usual resistance to tyranny. He proved that you could rule a republic without destroying it. You simply had to control who made the real decisions while maintaining the fiction of democratic process. The Medici would rule Florence, with interruptions, for another 3 centuries. Not through military might. The family never commanded significant armies, but through the mechanisms Cosimo established: debt, patronage, and the careful cultivation of obligation. His grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent would perfect the system. His descendants would become popes, queens, and grand dukes. But all of them operated on principles Cosimo pioneered. Power isn't seized, it's purchased. Authority isn't declared, it's cultivated. And control isn't maintained through fear, but through indispensability. Today, when we talk about political machines, about party bosses who control nominations, about patronage networks that transcend official government, we're describing variations on Cosimo's model. When we see powerful figures who hold no official title but somehow control policy, advisors, donors, fixers, we're watching Cosimo's strategy play out. When we observe how political power often flows not through elections but through obligation networks, who owes whom, who depends on whom, we're seeing the system Cosimo systematized. He weaponized something that had always existed but never been deployed systematically. The fact that in any society, real power belongs not to those who give orders, but to those who control resources others need. Kings could command, but bankers could decide whether those commands would be funded. Generals could plan wars, but financiers determined whether those wars could be fought. Politicians could win elections, but patrons decided who could run. Cosimo was the first to build an entire political system around this insight, and once built, the system proved remarkably durable. Florence never truly recovered its republican character. The forms continued: elections, councils, debates. But everyone understood they were performing republicanism, not practicing it. Real power had moved into the shadows, into ledgers and favors and obligations, into relationships that didn't appear on any organizational chart, but determined everything that appeared on them. Cosimo de Medici proved that the greatest tyranny is the one that doesn't announce itself. The most complete control is the kind that lets people believe they're still free. He took a city without an army. He ruled a republic without a throne. And he created a template for hidden power that still governs much of how the world works today. Because, in the end, the strongest chains aren't made of iron. They're made of debt, gratitude, and the quiet understanding that some people are simply too important to oppose. Cosimo de Medici never commanded an army, never wore a crown, never held power long enough to be called a tyrant. But for 30 years, nothing happened in Florence without his approval, because he understood something that military conquerors never grasped. The person everyone owes can never be overthrown. He built the first modern political machine, a system where power flowed through obligation rather than force, through patronage rather than law, through financial dependence rather than military dominance. And that machine, refined, adapted, but fundamentally unchanged, still runs most political systems today. If you're starting to recognize this pattern in your own political system, subscribe to follow the rest of the series. Like this, if you'd never realized that modern political machines were invented in Renaissance Florence. Comment which contemporary political figure most resembles Cosimo's model of power without office. Share this with someone who still believes elections determine who holds real power. They don't. Obligation does. The series continues. The next man we cover invented something even more dangerous, the stock market, and the first great crash that came with it. Cosimo de Medici proved that you don't conquer cities with armies. You buy them with debt. And once bought, they never realize they've been sold.